Welcome to the channel, Stories of Slavery. Today's story takes us to 1861. Celia fed her masters day after day, plate after plate, until they grew heavy, slow, obese with excess. Then the enslaved woman did something no one would ever forget. This is not an easy story. Pause for a moment. Listen closely. Before we begin, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments the city and country you're listening from. Your voice keeps these lives remembered, not erased. Let's begin. On the morning of April 12, 1861, while Confederate cannons opened fire on Fort Sumter in South Carolina, something far quieter but equally revolutionary was happening 600 miles away in the Louisiana Bayou country. A woman who could not legally read or write was about to orchestrate one of the most audacious escapes in the history of American slavery. Her name was Celia. She was 31 years old. And after 17 years of cooking for a family that had taken everything from her, she was about to take it all back. This is the story plantation owners tried to erase from history. This is the story of how one woman used patience, intelligence, and a cast-iron skillet to defeat an entire system designed to crush her. And this is the story of a single plate left on a breakfast table that would haunt a family until their dying days. But to understand what happened on that April morning, we need to go back. We need to travel to a place called Magnolia Grove, to a kitchen that smelled of wood smoke and suffering, and to a young girl who arrived there with nothing but the recipes her mother had whispered to her on the auction block. Magnolia Grove Plantation sat 12 miles northwest of Baton Rouge, Louisiana, in a parish that would later be known as East Feliciana. The property sprawled across 2,400 acres of rich bottomland along Thompson Creek, a tributary that fed into the Mississippi River. In 1844, when our story begins, the plantation was home to 84 enslaved people and produced nearly 900 bales of cotton per year, each bale weighing approximately 400 pounds. The land had been in the Beaumont family for 3 generations, passed down from a French-Canadian fur trader who had received the original Spanish land grant in 1779. The main house was a Greek Revival mansion with 14 rooms, 6 white columns, and a front porch that stretched 60 feet across. Visitors from New Orleans often made the 3-day journey upriver just to see it. But they did not come for the architecture. They came for the food. The Beaumont family was famous throughout Louisiana for one thing above all else, their table. Dinner at Magnolia Grove was an event that people discussed for months afterward. 7 courses. Fine china imported from England, crystal glasses from France, and dishes so extraordinary that grown men had been known to weep after tasting them. What those visitors never knew, what they never bothered to ask, was who actually created those dishes. The answer was working 18 hours a day in a sweltering kitchen house located 50 feet behind the main mansion, a separate building made of brick to reduce the risk of fire. Inside that kitchen, in temperatures that regularly exceeded 110 degrees during Louisiana summers, a young woman was performing miracles with flour, butter, and whatever ingredients she could coax from the plantation gardens. Her name, as recorded in the Beaumont family ledger dated March 3, 1844, was simply Celia. Female. Approximately 14 years. Cook. Purchased Charleston, $650. That single line was all the official record that existed of her arrival. It told nothing of the auction block where she had stood barefoot in the South Carolina spring mud. It told nothing of the moment the auctioneer had pulled her from her mother's arms. It told nothing of the 3-week journey by ship and then by river barge that had brought her to Louisiana. And it certainly told nothing of the words her mother had whispered to her in those final seconds before they were separated forever. Her mother, whose name was Dinah, had been a cook on the Pettigrew plantation near Charleston for 22 years. She had learned to cook from her own mother, who had learned from hers, in a chain of knowledge that stretched back to the rice kitchens of West Africa. Dinah knew things about food that no French-trained chef would ever understand. She knew how to make something from nothing. She knew how to transform the scraps that slave owners deemed unworthy of their tables into dishes that nourished both body and soul. And in those precious final moments with her daughter, she passed on the most important lesson she had ever learned. Remember everything, Dinah had whispered as the auctioneer approached. Watch them. Learn them. They will underestimate you because they think we are nothing. That is their weakness. Make yourself valuable. Make yourself necessary. And when the time comes, you will know what to do. Celia was 14 years old when she heard those words. She would carry them for the next 17 years like a stone in her pocket, smooth from constant touching, a reminder of everything she had lost and everything she still had left to do. The Beaumont family who purchased her consisted of 5 people. The patriarch was Master Henri Beaumont, age 52 in 1844, a man whose appetites were legendary even by the excessive standards of the antebellum South. Henri stood 5 feet 9 inches tall and weighed, according to his own doctor's records that survived the war, approximately 280 pounds. He suffered from gout, digestive complaints, and a heart condition that his physician had warned him about repeatedly. He ignored every warning. Food was his passion, his obsession, and ultimately his destruction. His wife, Marguerite Beaumont, was 47 years old and nearly as large as her husband. She had been considered a beauty in her youth, the daughter of a wealthy sugar planter from St. James Parish. Now she rarely left the house, finding the Louisiana heat unbearable for someone of her size. She spent her days in a specially reinforced rocking chair on the back gallery, fanning herself and directing the household enslaved people in their duties. She had particular opinions about food and was never satisfied with anything. Their 3 children were all grown by 1844. The eldest, Henri Jr., was 24 and had already developed his father's physique and appetites. He managed the plantation's day-to-day operations with a cruelty that even other slaveholders found distasteful. The middle child, Marguerite Claire, was 22 and had been married to a planter from Natchez. She visited often, always bringing her own complaints about the food at her husband's home. The youngest, Philippe, was 19 and studying law in New Orleans, returning home every few months to remind his family how sophisticated he had become. Into this household came Celia, a terrified 14-year-old who had never seen Louisiana before, who spoke the Gullah dialect of the Carolina Lowcountry that the Beaumonts could barely understand, and who had exactly one asset that would determine her entire future: she could cook. The previous cook at Magnolia Grove had died 3 weeks before Celia's arrival. She had been an elderly woman named Hester, who had worked in the kitchen for 41 years. Her death had thrown the household into chaos. Marguerite Beaumont had attempted to supervise the cooking herself, an experiment that lasted exactly 2 days before she declared it impossible. Henri Beaumont had sent his agents to Charleston with specific instructions: find a cook. Find a good one. And bring her back regardless of cost. They found Celia on the auction block on a Tuesday morning in February 1844. The Pettigrew family was selling off their enslaved people to pay debts, and Dinah's daughter was listed in the sale catalog as trained in cookery. The Beaumont agent, a man named Thibodeau, asked her 2 questions: could she make gumbo? Could she make biscuits? When Celia nodded yes to both, Thibodeau bid $650, won her, and put her on a ship that same afternoon. She arrived at Magnolia Grove on March 3, 1844. The kitchen house, where she would spend most of the next 17 years, was waiting for her. The kitchen was a single large room measuring approximately 20 by 30 feet. One entire wall was dominated by a massive fireplace with a cooking crane that could swing iron pots over the flames. There was a brick bake oven built into the side of the fireplace, its interior blackened from decades of use. A long wooden worktable ran down the center of the room, its surface scarred and stained from thousands of meals prepared upon it. Shelves lined the walls holding an assortment of crockery, iron pans, copper pots, and utensils. 2 small windows provided the only ventilation, utterly inadequate for the heat that built up when all the fires were burning. Celia walked into that kitchen on her first morning at Magnolia Grove, looked around at the equipment she had to work with, and understood that this was where she would either survive or die. There was no middle ground. Her first test came that very evening. Marguerite Beaumont sent word that there would be guests for dinner, a judge from Baton Rouge and his wife. Celia had 4 hours to prepare a meal worthy of the Beaumont reputation. She had never cooked in this kitchen before. She did not know where anything was stored. She did not know the peculiarities of the fireplace, which spots burned hot and which burned cool. She did not know what ingredients were available in the smokehouse, the dairy, or the garden. And she did not know what the Beaumont family considered acceptable. What she did know was everything her mother had taught her. She knew that fear was useless and had to be pushed aside. She knew that her hands remembered things her mind might forget. And she knew that the most important ingredient in any dish was not butter or salt or spice, but attention, complete, unwavering attention to every detail. That evening, Celia served roasted chicken with a sauce made from pan drippings, butter, and herbs she had found growing wild behind the kitchen. She served rice cooked in the Carolina style, each grain separate and perfect. She served biscuits that rose so high and light that Marguerite Beaumont later said they looked like clouds that had wandered into the bread basket by mistake. And she served a simple cake made with molasses and pecans that the judge's wife requested the recipe for 3 times before the evening was over. She was 14 years old. She was terrified. And she had just saved her own life. Word spread quickly through the household and then through the parish. The Beaumonts had found a cook. Not just any cook, but someone special, someone whose food was different from anything anyone had tasted before. Invitations to dinner at Magnolia Grove, always coveted, became almost impossible to obtain. Henri Beaumont found himself popular in a way he had never experienced before. People wanted to know him, to befriend him, to secure a place at his table. For Celia, this success meant survival. But it also meant something else entirely: invisibility. She became so associated with the kitchen that the Beaumont family stopped seeing her as a person at all. She was simply the cook, a function rather than a human being. She served meals and disappeared. She worked 18-hour days and slept on a pallet in the corner of the kitchen house. She had no days off, no holidays, no rest. She existed only to produce food. And that invisibility, that erasure of her humanity, would become the very thing that allowed her to plan their downfall. The years passed in a rhythm of seasons and meals. Spring brought fresh vegetables from the garden, tender lettuces, young onions, the first asparagus. Summer meant the crushing heat of the kitchen during canning season, when Celia would preserve hundreds of jars of fruits and vegetables for the winter months ahead. Fall was butchering time, when hogs were slaughtered, and she would work for days processing meat into hams, bacon, and sausages. Winter offered a brief respite from the worst of the heat, though the kitchen fires still blazed from before dawn until long after dark. Through it all, Celia watched. She watched the family as she served them. She watched their habits, their weaknesses, their petty cruelties and small vanities. She watched the way Henri Beaumont counted money in his study, his fingers moving across the bills with the same loving attention she gave to her biscuit dough. She watched where he kept the key to his safe, how he opened it, what combination he used. She watched Marguerite Beaumont's addiction to laudanum, the way she became drowsy and confused each evening after her medicine. She watched Henri Jr.'s gambling debts pile up, his increasingly desperate attempts to hide his losses from his father. She watched everything. And she remembered everything, exactly as her mother had told her to do. By 1850, Celia had been at Magnolia Grove for 6 years. She was 20 years old, and she had become the most valuable enslaved person on the entire plantation. Her value, as recorded in the Beaumont insurance documents from that year, was listed at $2,000, more than 3 times what they had paid for her. The same document noted that she was of excellent health and temperament, skilled in all forms of cookery, and essential to the household operation. Essential, that word would come to mean everything. In the summer of 1853, something happened that would change the course of Celia's life forever. She gave birth to a son. The father was a man named Thomas, who worked as a blacksmith on a neighboring plantation. They had met when Thomas was hired to repair equipment at Magnolia Grove, and over the course of 3 years they had fallen in love in the only way enslaved people could, in stolen moments, whispered conversations, and the constant fear that any day one of them might be sold away forever. When Celia discovered she was pregnant, she told no one. She continued working in the kitchen until the very last moment, hiding her condition beneath the loose dresses that all cooking women wore. The Beaumont family never noticed. They never looked at her closely enough to notice anything. She gave birth in the kitchen house on a sweltering August night, attended only by an elderly woman named Aunt Josephine, who had delivered most of the enslaved children on the plantation for the past 30 years. The baby was a boy, healthy and strong, with his father's broad forehead and his mother's watchful eyes. Celia named him Samuel, after a man in the Bible who had been dedicated to God's service before he was born. She did not know if God was watching over the enslaved. But she knew that she would dedicate her life to her son's survival, whatever it took, whatever she had to do. The Beaumont family learned of Samuel's existence a week after his birth. Marguerite Beaumont's only comment, recorded in her diary, was, "The cook has had a child. I hope this will not affect her work." It did not. Celia was back at the stove 3 days after giving birth, Samuel sleeping in a basket near the fire where she could watch him while she worked. For the next 8 years, Celia raised her son in that kitchen. He learned to walk on the worn wooden floors. He learned to talk while sitting on a stool watching his mother cook. He learned to read and write in secret, taught by Celia during the brief hours when the family was asleep, using a spelling book that had been smuggled to her by a free black man who delivered goods to the plantation. Teaching Samuel to read was the most dangerous thing Celia had ever done. Louisiana law, specifically Act 26 of 1830, made it a crime to teach any enslaved person to read or write, punishable by imprisonment for up to 12 months. If discovered, both Celia and whoever had given her the book could face severe punishment. But Celia had decided something during those long nights nursing her infant son. She had decided that Samuel would not grow up in ignorance. He would have knowledge. He would have skills. And when the opportunity came, he would have a chance at freedom. By 1861, Samuel was 8 years old. He was smart, quick, and curious about everything. He could read at a level that would have impressed most white children his age. He could do arithmetic, could write in a clear hand, and had memorized long passages from the Bible that Celia had taught him. He was also old enough to understand what he was, what his status in this world was, and what it meant for his future. The Beaumont family had noticed Samuel by now. More specifically, Henri Jr. had noticed him. Henri Jr., now 41 years old and running the plantation with an increasingly desperate hand as his gambling debts mounted, had begun looking at Samuel with an expression that made Celia's blood run cold. He was calculating the boy's value. In January of 1861, Celia's worst fears were confirmed. She was serving dinner when she overheard Henri Jr. speaking to his father about finances. The conversation was held in French, which the Beaumonts assumed their enslaved people did not understand. They were wrong. Celia had taught herself French over 17 years of listening to family conversations, and she understood every word. "The Hutchinson debt must be paid by April," Henri Jr. said. $4,300. "We don't have it." "Then we sell," Henri Sr. replied, his mouth full of roasted pork. "Sell some of the field hands. I've already spoken to the traders. The market is depressed. We'd get nothing for them." "Then what do you suggest?" Henri Jr. paused, and Celia felt his eyes move toward the kitchen door where Samuel often sat in the evenings, waiting for his mother. "The cook's boy," he said. "I've had inquiries. Bright child, strong. The Hutchinson plantation in Mississippi is looking for young stock. They'd pay well for him." The Hutchinson plantation, Celia knew that name. Everyone knew that name. It was located in the Mississippi Delta near a place called Sunflower County. The mortality rate for enslaved people there was catastrophic. The work was brutal, the conditions inhuman. They called it the Inferno. Sending a child there was essentially a death sentence. "He's worth more here," Henri Sr. said dismissively. "His mother cooks better when he's around. She'd be useless if we sold him. She'd adjust. They always do." Celia stood frozen in the doorway, the serving dish in her hands growing cold. She heard Henri Sr. grunt, which meant he was considering it. She heard Henri Jr. press his case, talking about the debts, the interest, the urgency. And she heard finally the words that would set everything in motion. "Fine," Henri Sr. said. "But not until April. Let her prepare the spring entertaining season first. After Easter, you can do what you want with the boy." April. Celia had until April. She had 3 months to do the impossible. 3 months to plan an escape. 3 months to save her son's life. That night, after the family had gone to bed, Celia sat in the kitchen house with her sleeping son and made a decision. She would not run blindly into the swamps, hoping for the best. She would not trust to luck or God or the kindness of strangers. She would plan. She would prepare. And she would use every single thing she had learned in 17 years of watching this family to destroy them. The first thing she needed was information. She needed to know the routes north, the safe houses, the people who could be trusted. She needed to understand the geography between Louisiana and freedom, the rivers to cross, the towns to avoid, the distances involved. The second thing she needed was money. Escaping was not free. There were bribes to pay, transportation to arrange, food and supplies to acquire. Without money, even the most carefully planned escape would fail. The third thing she needed was time. Time to prepare without arousing suspicion. Time to put everything in place. Time to wait for the perfect moment. And she had exactly 3 months to acquire all three. The next morning, Celia began to cook. She cooked with more skill and more attention than she ever had before. She prepared meals that made Henri Beaumont moan with pleasure. She created desserts that Marguerite Beaumont declared were the finest she had ever tasted. She established herself in those critical weeks as absolutely indispensable. But in the hours between midnight and dawn, when the family slept off their massive meals, Celia was doing something else entirely. She was building a network. It started with a man named Ezekiel, who drove the supply wagon that came to Magnolia Grove every 2 weeks from Baton Rouge. Ezekiel was a free black man, one of the approximately 18,000 free people of color living in Louisiana before the war. He had documents proving his status, which allowed him to travel freely throughout the region. And he had connections to something that most white Southerners refused to believe existed, the Underground Railroad. The Underground Railroad in Louisiana was different from its northern branches. There was no clear path to Canada from the Deep South. Instead, the Louisiana network focused on getting people to Mexico, where slavery had been abolished in 1829, or to the free black communities in New Orleans, where escaped slaves could sometimes blend in with the free population. The roads were dangerous, the distances enormous, and the chances of success frighteningly small. But they existed. And Ezekiel knew them all. Celia approached him carefully over the course of several weeks. A comment here, a question there. A small gift of food that let him know she could be trusted. Finally, in late January, she told him what she needed. "I need to get north," she whispered while loading supplies from his wagon. "Me and my son." Before April. Ezekiel did not react visibly. He had heard requests like this before. "North is hard," he said quietly. "Mexico is easier. I need to get to free territory. Real free territory. Somewhere they can't come after us. That's Canada. That's 1,800 miles from here. Through enemy territory every step of the way." "I know." Ezekiel was silent for a long moment. Then he nodded once. "I'll see what I can do." Over the next 6 weeks, Ezekiel became Celia's lifeline to the outside world. He brought her maps drawn on scraps of cloth that could be hidden in her clothing. He brought her names of people along the route who could provide shelter. He brought her information about river crossings, about the timing of slave patrols, about the 1,000 small details that would mean the difference between freedom and death. And he brought her something else, hope. The route he described would take them up the Mississippi to Memphis, then overland through Tennessee to Kentucky, then across the Ohio River into Indiana. From there, they would make their way to Detroit and cross into Canada. The journey was approximately 1,500 miles on foot, traveling at night, hiding during the day. It would take at least 2 months. 2 months of running, 2 months of terror, 2 months of hoping that every sound in the darkness was not a slave catcher's dog. But at the end of those 2 months, freedom. Real freedom. A life where Samuel could grow up as a human being rather than property. A life where Celia could cook for herself, for her son, for people who would pay her wages and treat her with respect. It was worth any risk. It was worth everything. But there was still the matter of money. Celia knew exactly where the Beaumont family kept their wealth. She had been watching for 17 years. Henri Beaumont kept a safe in his study, a heavy iron box manufactured by the Diebold Company of Cincinnati. It was built into the wall behind a portrait of his father. The combination was 3 numbers that he changed every few months, but which Celia had memorized each time by watching his fingers as she served him coffee during his evening accounting sessions. The current combination, as of February 1861, was 23 right, 7 left, 31 right. Inside that safe, according to what Celia had observed over the years, was approximately $3,000 in paper currency, another $1,500 in gold coins, and Marguerite Beaumont's jewelry collection valued at perhaps $5,000 or more. There were also documents, the plantation's financial records, notes on various debts and loans, and the ownership papers for every enslaved person on the property. Those ownership papers were what Celia wanted most of all. In the antebellum South, an enslaved person caught without proper documentation was subject to immediate arrest and sale. But an enslaved person with forged freedom papers could sometimes pass as a free person of color, at least long enough to reach safety. If Celia could destroy the Beaumont's records of ownership and create believable forgeries showing that she and Samuel had been legally freed, their chances of successful escape would increase dramatically. It was an audacious plan. It was also incredibly dangerous. If she was caught opening that safe, the punishment would be severe. At minimum, she would be whipped. More likely, she would be sold south to the very plantation where they were planning to send Samuel. At worst, she could be killed outright. But Celia had stopped weighing risks the moment she heard Henri Jr. casually discuss selling her child to his death. There were no longer any risks too great to take. In early March, Celia put the second phase of her plan into motion. She began to cook even more elaborately than before, creating meals so rich and so plentiful that the Beaumont family was stuffed to discomfort every single night. She made gravies thick with butter. She made desserts heavy with cream and sugar. She made portions that would have fed twice the number of people at the table. And the Beaumonts ate. They always ate. They could not help themselves. By the end of March, Henri Beaumont had gained nearly 15 pounds. His wife was so heavy that she required assistance to rise from her chair. Henri Jr. had developed a persistent indigestion that kept him awake at night. The entire family was lethargic, bloated, and increasingly immobile. This was not accidental. This was strategy. Celia knew that her escape would require every possible advantage. A family too stuffed to move quickly would be slow to respond when they discovered what had happened. A family sedated by their own gluttony would sleep more deeply, giving her more time to act. A family accustomed to excess would not notice the subtle changes she was making in their household until it was far too late. Meanwhile, she was making other preparations. She was setting aside small amounts of food that would travel well, dried meat, hard biscuits, cheese preserved in wax. She was gathering warm clothing for herself and Samuel, hiding it in a bundle beneath the kitchen floorboards. She was memorizing every detail of the route north, going over it in her mind each night until she could recite it in her sleep. And she was recruiting allies. Magnolia Grove, like most large plantations, was home to a community of enslaved people who had developed their own networks of communication and mutual support. News traveled through the quarters with astonishing speed, passed from person to person in whispers, in coded songs, in the turn of a phrase that meant nothing to white ears but everything to those who knew how to listen. Celia let it be known, carefully and quietly, that something was going to happen. She did not say what. She did not say when. But she made sure that the other enslaved people on the plantation understood that an opportunity might present itself, and that those who were ready to take it should prepare. By April 1, 37 people had indicated their willingness to run. They ranged in age from a grandmother of 60 who refused to die in bondage, to a young man of 19 who had been threatened with sale the previous month. They included field hands and house servants, skilled craftsmen, and common laborers. They came from different backgrounds, different jobs, different quarters of the plantation. But they all shared one thing: they were ready to risk everything for freedom. Celia did not know if all 37 would actually go when the moment came. She understood that some might lose their nerve, that others might be unable to get away from their duties, that circumstances might prevent the best-laid plans from succeeding. But she also understood that there was power in numbers. The more people who escaped at once, the harder it would be for the Beaumonts to pursue any single individual. The confusion alone would buy precious time. April 12, 1861. The date had been chosen carefully. Celia had learned from Ezekiel that the Confederate attack on Fort Sumter was expected any day. The entire South was holding its breath, waiting for the war that everyone knew was coming. When it finally began, there would be chaos. Telegraph lines would be overwhelmed with military communications. Newspapers would focus on nothing but the war. Slave patrols would be distracted, their attention drawn to matters they considered more important than runaway property. It was the perfect moment to disappear. On the morning of April 12, Celia woke before dawn as she always did. She built up the fire in the kitchen hearth as she always did. She began preparing breakfast as she always did. Nothing in her behavior suggested that this day would be any different from the thousands of days that had come before. But everything was different. Everything was about to change. The dinner she prepared that evening would be the most important meal of her life. It would be her masterpiece, her final gift to the family that had stolen 17 years of her existence. It would be the meal that would set her free. She began cooking at noon. She had 12 hours until the time she had chosen to act, and she intended to use every minute of them. The menu she had planned was extensive. There would be roasted pork, a whole pig that had been turning on a spit since morning. There would be fried chicken, dozens of pieces prepared in the cast-iron skillets she had seasoned over years of use. There would be oyster stew made with shellfish brought up from the Gulf. There would be biscuits, her famous biscuits, fluffy and golden and irresistible. There would be vegetables swimming in butter. There would be cornbread soaked in pot liquor. There would be 3 different kinds of pie and a towering layer cake that she had started the day before. And there would be whiskey, bottles and bottles of Henri Beaumont's finest bourbon, which Celia had been secretly setting aside for weeks. By 6 o'clock, the dining room table was groaning under the weight of more food than even the Beaumont family could consume in a week. The family gathered, their eyes wide with anticipation. Henri Jr. had invited 2 local planters to join them, men who had heard of the Beaumont table and were eager to experience it for themselves. Celia served them. She moved around the table silently, refilling plates, pouring drinks, the perfect picture of servitude. No one looked at her face. No one noticed the way her hands trembled slightly as she set down each dish. No one saw the fierce determination in her eyes. They ate for 3 hours. They ate until they could barely move. They ate until Henri Beaumont had to loosen his belt and lean back in his chair, groaning with satisfaction. They ate until Marguerite Beaumont declared that she could not possibly take another bite, and then ate 3 more pieces of cake. They ate until the 2 visitors had fallen asleep at the table, their heads nodding forward over plates still half full of food. By 10 o'clock, the dinner was over. The guests had been poured into their carriages and sent home. The family had retired to their bedrooms, too full to do anything but sleep. The house had fallen into the deep silence of exhausted slumber. Celia stood in the kitchen, looking out the window at the main house. Every light had been extinguished. Every door had been closed. Every member of the Beaumont family was unconscious, sleeping off the biggest meal of their lives. It was time. She moved quietly through the darkness, her bare feet making no sound on the worn paths between the outbuildings. She had walked these paths thousands of times, carrying food to the main house, returning dirty dishes to the kitchen, moving through the invisible choreography of servitude. Tonight she walked them for the last time. She found Samuel where she had told him to wait, in the small shed behind the kitchen where the firewood was stored. He was awake, alert, his eyes shining in the darkness. He knew what was happening. They had talked about it in whispers over the past weeks, going over the plan again and again until he could recite every step. "It's time," Celia whispered. "Are you ready?" Samuel nodded. He was 8 years old. He was about to walk away from the only home he had ever known. and he was not afraid. Or if he was afraid, he did not show it. Celia took his hand, and together they moved through the darkness toward the main house. But they did not go to the kitchen door, the servants' entrance that Celia had used every day for 17 years. Instead, they went to the front of the house, to the columned porch, to the door that enslaved people were forbidden to use under any circumstances. Tonight, Celia was through following their rules. The front door was unlocked. The Beaumonts never bothered to lock it. Who would dare to enter uninvited? Who would have the audacity to walk into a white man's house without permission? Celia would. Celia did. She crossed the threshold into the grand foyer, her son's hand tight in hers. She paused for a moment, listening for any sound that might indicate someone was awake. There was nothing but the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner and the distant sound of Henri Beaumont snoring from upstairs. The study was down the hall to the left. Celia had been in it hundreds of times, serving coffee and meals while Henri Beaumont worked at his desk. She knew every piece of furniture, every book on the shelves, every shadow in the corners. She knew where the safe was hidden. Moving silently, she crossed the foyer and entered the study. Moonlight streamed through the windows, providing just enough illumination to see. She went straight to the portrait of Henri Beaumont's father that hung on the wall behind the desk. She lifted it carefully off its hooks and set it on the floor. The safe was exactly where she knew it would be, built into the wall, its iron door cold to the touch. Celia placed her fingers on the dial and began to turn it. 23 right, 7 left, 31 right. The lock clicked open. Celia pulled the heavy door toward her and looked inside. Everything was exactly as she had expected: stacks of paper currency, a cloth bag of gold coins, a wooden box containing Marguerite's jewelry, and a leather folder containing documents, including the ownership papers for every enslaved person on Magnolia Grove plantation. She took it all. The money went into a canvas bag she had brought for that purpose. The jewelry followed. The ownership papers she tucked inside her dress, against her skin, where she would feel them with every step she took toward freedom. The safe was empty. 17 years of the Beaumont family's accumulated wealth, gone in less than 5 minutes. But Celia was not finished. She had one more thing to do before she left this house forever. She went to the kitchen and retrieved a single plate from the shelf, one of the fine china plates that the Beaumonts used for their elaborate dinners. She carried it to the dining room, where the remains of that evening's feast still covered the table. She set the plate down at the head of the table, where Henri Beaumont always sat. The plate was empty. Completely, deliberately, unmistakably empty. Beside it, she placed a folded piece of paper. On that paper, in the careful handwriting she had taught herself over years of secret practice, she had written 7 words. You ate our pain. Now feel hunger, *. Then she turned and walked out of Magnolia Grove forever. Outside, the night was waiting for her. Outside, 37 people were gathering in the darkness, ready to follow her toward freedom. Outside, the first shots of the Civil War had been fired that very morning, and a world was beginning to change. Celia took her son's hand and began to walk north. The story was just beginning. The night of April 12, 1861, was moonless. Clouds had rolled in from the Gulf of Mexico during the evening, blotting out the stars and wrapping the Louisiana countryside in a darkness so complete that Celia could barely see her hand in front of her face. For most people, this would have been terrifying. For 38 escaped slaves moving through the bayou country, it was a blessing. They gathered at the predetermined spot, a clearing in the woods about half a mile from the main plantation buildings. Celia had chosen this location weeks earlier during one of her rare excursions to gather wild herbs for her cooking. It was far enough from the slave quarters that their movement would not be noticed, but close enough that everyone could reach it without getting lost in the darkness. By midnight, 37 people had assembled. They ranged from old Josephine, the 60-year-old midwife who had delivered Samuel 8 years earlier, to Marcus, a 19-year-old field hand whose back still bore fresh scars from a whipping he had received the previous month. There were families with children, couples who had been separated by sale and were reuniting for this journey, and solitary individuals who had no one left to lose. They stood in the darkness, barely breathing, waiting for Celia to tell them what to do next. She had never led anyone before. She had spent her entire life following orders, keeping her head down, making herself invisible. But standing in that clearing with 37 pairs of eyes fixed on her, something shifted inside Celia. She was no longer the cook. She was no longer property. She was the woman who was going to lead these people to freedom or die trying. "We walk until dawn," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "No talking. No noise. Stay close to the person in front of you. If you fall behind, we cannot stop. If you are caught, do not reveal the route. Do you understand?" 37 heads nodded in the darkness. "Then let's go." They moved out in single file, with Celia at the front and Marcus bringing up the rear. Samuel walked directly behind his mother, one hand clutching the back of her dress so he would not lose her in the darkness. They followed a path that Celia had memorized from Ezekiel's maps, a route that wound through swamps and forests, avoiding roads and settlements, staying as far as possible from anywhere they might be seen. The first obstacle came within the first hour. Thompson Creek, the waterway that bordered the eastern edge of Magnolia Grove, had to be crossed. The water was waist-deep in most places, chest-deep in others, and the current was strong enough to sweep a person off their feet if they were not careful. Celia had anticipated this. She had identified a crossing point where the creek widened and grew shallower, a spot where even the children could wade across without being submerged. They crossed one at a time, forming a human chain to steady each other against the current. The water was cold, shockingly cold for Louisiana in April, and several of the older escapees gasped as it soaked through their clothing. But no one complained. No one made a sound louder than a whisper. They understood that their lives depended on silence. On the other side of the creek, they paused to wring out their clothes and catch their breath. Celia counted heads in the darkness. 37, plus herself and Samuel. Everyone had made it across. They continued walking. By the time the first gray light of dawn began to appear on the eastern horizon, they had covered approximately 8 miles. It was not nearly enough. They were still well within the area where slave patrols regularly operated, still close enough to Magnolia Grove that a determined pursuit could catch them within hours. But they could not travel during daylight. They would have to hide. The hiding place Celia had chosen was an abandoned tobacco barn on a farm that had been foreclosed 3 years earlier. The property was overgrown, the buildings falling apart, and no one had any reason to visit it. Inside the barn, buried under moldy hay and rotting timber, they would wait out the day. It was cramped, uncomfortable, and terrifying. 39 people packed into a space meant for storing crops, barely able to move, hardly daring to breathe. The children were told to sleep if they could. The adults took turns keeping watch through the gaps in the barn's walls, scanning the horizon for any sign of pursuit. None came. Not that first day. While the escaped slaves huddled in their hiding place, something very different was happening 12 miles away at Magnolia Grove Plantation. Henri Beaumont woke at approximately 9 o'clock in the morning, which was late for him. His head ached from the whiskey he had consumed the night before, and his stomach churned with the after-effects of the enormous meal. He lay in bed for several minutes, waiting for the nausea to pass, before finally summoning the strength to sit up. His first thought was that he wanted coffee. His second thought was that he wanted breakfast. His third thought, which came only after he had rung the bell for service 3 times without response, was that something was wrong. He found his wife in the hallway, looking confused and irritated. She had also been ringing for service. She had also received no response. The house was silent in a way it had never been silent before. They went downstairs together, moving slowly because of their size and the lingering effects of the previous night's excess. They found the dining room first. The table was still covered with the remains of last night's feast, dishes of cold food surrounded by flies, wine glasses still half full. At the head of the table, in Henry's customary place, sat a single empty plate and a folded piece of paper. Marguerite Beaumont would later tell people that her husband's face turned the color of ash when he read those 7 words. She would describe how his hands shook, how the paper fluttered to the ground, How he stood frozen for what felt like an eternity before he finally found his voice. "She's gone," he said. "The cook is gone." But that was only the beginning of the horror. Henri Jr. was awakened by his father's shouting. He came downstairs to find both his parents in the study, staring at an empty safe. The portrait of his grandfather lay on the floor. The iron door stood open. And everything that should have been inside was gone. The money, the gold, the jewelry, the documents, all of it vanished. Henri Jr. ran outside, still in his nightclothes, and headed straight for the slave quarters. What he found there confirmed his worst fears. The cabins were empty. Not all of them, but enough. He counted quickly, his mind racing. At least 30 people were missing. Maybe more. And among those missing was the cook's son, the boy he had planned to sell in just a few weeks. The alarm went out within the hour. Messengers were dispatched to neighboring plantations, to the sheriff's office in Clinton, to the slave patrol headquarters in Baton Rouge. By noon, the largest manhunt in East Feliciana Parish history was underway. But by noon, Celia and her group were 8 miles away, hidden in an abandoned barn, invisible to the searchers who were looking in all the wrong places. The pursuit that followed would last for weeks and cover hundreds of miles. It would involve dozens of men on horseback, packs of trained tracking dogs, and a reward that eventually reached $5,000, an enormous sum in 1861. It would be complicated by the outbreak of war, by the chaos that was spreading across the South, and by the simple fact that 39 people traveling together could not be tracked as easily as a single fugitive. Because Celia had done something clever, something that the slave catchers did not expect. On the second night of their journey, she split the group. They had reached a crossroads about 20 miles north of Magnolia Grove, a place where the route divided into 3 separate paths. One led northwest toward the Red River. Another led northeast toward Natchez. The third continued due north toward Jackson, Mississippi. Celia gathered the group in the darkness and explained her plan. They would divide into 3 smaller groups, each taking a different route. They would travel separately for the next several days, making it impossible for pursuers to know which group to follow. Then, if all went well, they would reunite at a safe house outside Memphis, approximately 200 miles to the north. It was a risk. Smaller groups meant less protection, less support, fewer people to help if something went wrong. But smaller groups also meant faster travel, easier concealment, and a much better chance of at least some of them reaching freedom. Old Josephine would lead one group of 12, taking the western route toward the Red River. Marcus would lead another group of 13, heading northeast toward Natchez. Celia would take the remaining 12, including Samuel, straight north toward Jackson. They said their goodbyes in whispers, knowing that some of them might never see each other again. Then they separated into the darkness, each group heading toward a different horizon. The slave catchers, when they finally picked up the trail 2 days later, found themselves confronting an impossible puzzle. 3 sets of tracks leading in 3 different directions. 3 groups of escaped slaves, each one getting farther away with every passing hour, and limited resources that could not possibly cover all 3 routes simultaneously. They chose to focus on the northern route, reasoning that Celia, as the ringleader, would be heading directly for the Free States. It was a logical assumption. It was also exactly what Celia had expected them to assume. What she had not told anyone, not even Marcus or old Josephine, was that she had no intention of going directly to Memphis. Instead, she was taking her group on a longer, more circuitous route that would swing west before turning north, following the bayous and backwaters where horses and dogs could not easily travel. It would add at least a week to their journey. But it would also make them almost impossible to find. The days that followed blurred together into an endless sequence of walking, hiding, and walking again. They traveled only at night, navigating by the stars when the sky was clear, and by sheer memory when it was clouded. They slept during the day in whatever shelter they could find, abandoned buildings, dense thickets, the occasional friendly barn whose owner asked no questions and expected no answers. Food was a constant concern. Celia had brought provisions for perhaps 3 days, knowing that anything more would have been impossible to carry. After that, they survived on whatever they could find. Berries, nuts, the occasional vegetables stolen from a farm field in the dead of night. Twice they were able to trade some of Marguerite Beaumont's jewelry for supplies, exchanging diamonds and gold for cornmeal and dried meat. The children suffered the most. There were 4 of them in Celia's group, including Samuel, and the grueling pace of the journey tested their limits. They walked until their feet bled. They went hungry when there was not enough food to go around. They learned to sleep while standing, leaning against trees or their parents during the brief rest stops that Celia allowed. But they did not complain. Not once. Even the youngest, a 5-year-old girl named Patience, seemed to understand that silence was survival. She walked when she was told to walk. She hid when she was told to hide. And when she could no longer keep her eyes open, she let herself be carried without making a sound. Samuel, at 8 years old, was old enough to understand exactly what was happening and what was at stake. He stayed close to his mother, helping where he could, never questioning her decisions. At night, when they had stopped to rest, he would sometimes whisper questions about where they were going, what freedom would be like, whether they would ever see the people from the other groups again. Celia answered as honestly as she could. She did not know what freedom would be like. She had never experienced it. She did not know if they would see the others again. She could only hope. But she knew, with a certainty that had grown stronger with every mile they traveled, that they were going to make it. They had come too far to fail now. On the 7th night of their journey, they crossed into Mississippi. The border was invisible, unmarked by any fence or sign, but Celia knew when they had crossed it. The landscape changed subtly, the Louisiana swamps giving way to the pine forests of southwestern Mississippi. The air smelled different, drier, less heavy with the scent of decay. And somewhere in the back of her mind, a voice whispered that they were one step closer. Still, Mississippi was not freedom. Mississippi was a slave state, just as hostile to escaped slaves as Louisiana had been. The danger was just as great, the consequences of capture just as severe. They would have to cross nearly 300 miles of Mississippi before reaching Tennessee, and then another 100 miles of Tennessee before reaching Kentucky, and then the Ohio River, and then Indiana. 4 states. 500 miles. And every step of the way, people who would gladly turn them in for the reward money. But there were also people who would help. The Underground Railroad in Mississippi was smaller and more secretive than in the northern states, but it existed. Station masters and conductors operated in the shadows, risking their lives and their property to help escaped slaves reach freedom. They were a diverse group, free blacks who had purchased their own liberty, white abolitionists who believed slavery was a sin, Quakers whose faith demanded that they treat all people as equals, and ordinary individuals who simply could not stand by while human beings were treated as property. Celia made contact with the first of these helpers on the 8th night of their journey. His name was Solomon, and he operated a small farm about 30 miles north of the Louisiana border. He was a free black man, one of the few in that part of Mississippi, who had purchased his freedom 15 years earlier and spent every day since helping others achieve the same thing. His farm was known along the Underground Railroad as a safe haven, a place where escaped slaves could rest, eat, and gather strength for the next leg of their journey. Solomon took one look at Celia's exhausted group and ushered them into his barn without asking a single question. He brought food, water, and clean bandages for their blistered feet. He showed them where to sleep, hidden in a space behind the hayloft that was invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. And he told them they could rest for 2 days before continuing north. 2 days. It seemed like an eternity. During those 2 days of rest, Celia learned that she was not the only one making this journey. Solomon told her about other groups that had passed through in recent weeks, other escaped slaves fleeing the chaos of the impending war. The slave system, he said, was beginning to crack. The certainty that had held it together for generations was eroding, replaced by fear and uncertainty. More and more enslaved people were seizing this moment of weakness to make their escape. He also told her about the war. Fort Sumter had fallen. The Confederate States were mobilizing for conflict. President Lincoln was calling for volunteers to put down the rebellion. The entire country was lurching toward a war that would eventually claim more than 600,000 lives. But more importantly for Celia, the war was creating opportunities. Military movements were disrupting normal patterns of life across the South. Slave patrols were being disbanded as men left to join the Confederate Army. The attention of authorities was focused on matters they considered more important than tracking runaway property. "The next few months will be your best chance," Solomon told her. "After that, who knows? The war could last years. Anything could happen." Celia listened, processing this information, adding it to her mental calculations. They had been traveling for 8 days. They had covered approximately 100 miles. They had roughly 400 miles left to go. If Solomon was right about the war creating chaos, then the longer they traveled, the easier it might become. But they could not count on that. They could only count on themselves. On the morning of the 10th day since leaving Magnolia Grove, Celia and her group left Solomon's farm and continued north. They were rested, fed, and equipped with new supplies that Solomon had provided. They had fresh information about the route ahead, the safe houses they could trust, the dangers they needed to avoid. And they had something else that was perhaps even more valuable: hope. For the first time since that night in the Beaumont dining room, Celia allowed herself to believe that they might actually make it. The weeks that followed were the hardest of their journey. They crossed Mississippi in a zigzag pattern, never traveling in a straight line, always taking the most difficult and least expected route. They forded rivers, climbed hills, pushed through forests so dense that sunlight barely penetrated the canopy. They encountered snakes, alligators, and clouds of mosquitoes that left them covered in welts. They also had close calls. The closest came on the 23rd day of their journey, somewhere in the northeastern corner of Mississippi. They had stopped to rest during the day, hiding in a dense thicket of undergrowth about a quarter-mile from a main road. They had been there for perhaps 3 hours when Celia heard the sound she had been dreading since they left Louisiana: dogs barking. Getting closer. She gathered the group with frantic hand signals, urging them to move as quickly and quietly as possible. They abandoned their hiding spot and plunged deeper into the forest, trying to put distance between themselves and the approaching danger. Behind them, the barking grew louder, more insistent. They ran for what felt like hours, but was probably only about 30 minutes. They ran until their lungs burned and their legs threatened to give out. They ran until they reached a small creek that cut through the forest floor. Celia made a split-second decision. "Into the water," she whispered. "Walk upstream. The dogs can't track scent through water." They waded into the creek, gasping at the cold, and began to move upstream. The water was knee-deep, the bottom rocky and uneven. It was slow-going, painfully slow. But with each step, they were erasing their trail. They walked in the water for nearly 2 miles before Celia judged it safe to emerge. By then, the sound of dogs had faded into the distance. Either the pursuit had given up, or it had followed their trail to the creek and lost it there. Either way, they had escaped. But the experience left everyone shaken. They had come within minutes of being caught. If Celia had not heard the dogs when she did, if they had hesitated even a moment before fleeing, everything would have been lost. That night, they did not stop walking until dawn. They crossed into Tennessee on the 31st day of their journey. Tennessee was different from Mississippi. The state was deeply divided over the issue of secession, with the eastern portion generally favoring the Union and the western portion supporting the Confederacy. This division created pockets of safety and pockets of danger, often existing side by side. An escaped slave could find help in one town and be betrayed in the next. Celia navigated this landscape carefully, relying on the information Solomon had given her and on her own instincts. She learned to read people quickly, to judge within seconds whether someone could be trusted. She learned which questions to ask and which to avoid, which stories to tell and which to keep to herself. They passed through Tennessee in just over 2 weeks, traveling faster now that the most dangerous portion of the journey was behind them. The safe houses became more frequent, the helpers more numerous. For the first time, they encountered other escaped slaves traveling the same route, refugees from plantations across the South, who were all heading toward the same destination. Somewhere in the middle of Tennessee, they reconnected with Marcus and his group. It was a moment of pure joy in a journey that had contained precious few of them. Marcus and his 13 companions had survived their own harrowing journey, narrowly escaping capture twice and losing one member to illness along the way. They had been traveling for the same 5 weeks, covering roughly the same distance, facing the same dangers. Now they were together again, and stronger for it. There was still no word of old Josephine and her group. They could only hope that she had made it. That somewhere on the long road north, 12 more people were walking toward freedom. They crossed into Kentucky on the 47th day of their journey. Kentucky was a border state, technically remaining in the Union but deeply sympathetic to the Confederate cause. It was also the last barrier before the Ohio River, the symbolic and literal boundary between slavery and freedom. For generations, enslaved people had looked toward that river as the dividing line between bondage and liberty. Crossing it meant everything. But first, they had to get there. The route through Kentucky was the most heavily monitored portion of their entire journey. Slave catchers operated openly here, working both sides of the border, capturing escaped slaves and returning them to their owners for profit. Federal marshals enforced the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which required the return of escaped slaves, even in free states. The danger of capture was, in some ways, greater here than it had been in the Deep South. Celia's group, now numbering 24 after reuniting with Marcus, moved with extreme caution. They traveled only on the darkest nights, staying completely hidden during the day. They avoided all roads, all settlements, all contact with anyone who was not a known conductor on the Underground Railroad. They were so close to freedom that the thought of being caught now was almost unbearable. The final safe house before the river crossing was located just south of Louisville, operated by a white Quaker family named the Johnsons. They had been helping escaped slaves for more than 20 years, running a station on the Underground Railroad since before such a network even had a name. Their farm had a hidden cellar beneath the barn, large enough to shelter up to 50 people, completely invisible to the casual observer. Celia and her group arrived at the Johnson farm on the 52nd day of their journey. They had traveled approximately 1,200 miles. They had crossed 4 states. They had been walking for nearly 2 months. And they were less than 20 miles from the Ohio River. Martha Johnson, the matriarch of the family, looked at the exhausted group that stumbled into her barn that night and saw something she had seen many times before, the hollowed-out faces of people who had given everything they had for a chance at freedom. She fed them, clothed them in fresh garments that would help them blend in during the final leg of their journey, and told them to rest. "Tomorrow night," she said, "you will cross the river." The crossing was arranged for the early hours of the morning, when the darkness was deepest and the river traffic was lightest. A conductor named Samuel Green, a free black man who operated a ferry service that most white residents of Louisville believed was legitimate, would take them across in groups of 8. 3 trips, each one carrying a portion of their group to the Indiana shore. Celia insisted on being in the last group. She wanted to make sure everyone else made it across before she did. She wanted to be the one standing on the Kentucky shore, watching each boat disappear into the darkness, counting heads as they emerged on the other side. She wanted to know that Samuel, that Marcus, that every single person who had trusted her to lead them to freedom had actually made it. The first group crossed without incident. The second followed 30 minutes later, also successful. Then it was time for the final crossing. Celia climbed into the small boat with the last 7 members of their group. Samuel was beside her, his hand clutching hers as it had on that first night when they walked out of Magnolia Grove. The conductor pushed off from the shore, and they began to glide across the dark water. The Ohio River at that point was approximately a quarter-mile wide. The crossing took less than 15 minutes. But those 15 minutes felt like a lifetime. Celia watched the Kentucky shore recede behind them, watched the darkness swallow the land where slavery still existed, watched everything she had ever known disappear into the night. And then she turned to face forward, to face Indiana, to face freedom. When the boat touched the northern shore, Celia did not move immediately. She sat in the darkness, feeling the wooden hull scrape against the riverbank, listening to the others climb out around her. Samuel tugged at her hand, urging her to follow. But she needed a moment. Just a moment. She was free. After 31 years. After 17 years of slavery at Magnolia Grove. After 53 days of running, she was free. The tears came without warning, streaming down her face in the darkness. She did not try to stop them. She did not try to hide them. For the first time in her life, she was allowed to feel whatever she wanted to feel. She was allowed to cry. She was allowed to hope. She was allowed to be human. Samuel climbed back into the boat and wrapped his arms around her. He was 8 years old, and he understood in the way that children understand things that this moment meant everything. "We made it, Mama," he whispered. "We made it." Yes, they had. But the journey was not over yet. Indiana was a free state, but it was not safe. The Fugitive Slave Act meant that slave catchers could still operate here, could still capture escaped slaves and return them to the South. True safety lay further north, in Canada, where American laws did not apply and slavery had been abolished for decades. From the Indiana shore, Celia's group continued north. They traveled through Indianapolis, through Fort Wayne, through a network of safe houses that stretched across Indiana and into Michigan. They moved faster now, able to travel during the day in areas where slavery was illegal and public sympathy was on their side. They received help from abolitionists, from free black communities, from ordinary citizens who believed that no human being should be property. They reached Detroit on the 71st day of their journey. Detroit in 1861 was the final stop on the Underground Railroad, the gateway to Canada and permanent freedom. The city had a thriving free black community, many of them former slaves who had made the same journey in years past. They welcomed Celia's group with open arms, providing shelter, food, and assistance with the final border crossing. The Canadian shore was visible from Detroit, just across the Detroit River. It looked so close, so reachable, that Celia could hardly believe there was still a border to cross. But there was. And crossing it required one final boat ride, one final leap of faith. They crossed on a Tuesday morning in late June, 1861. The boat was larger than the one that had carried them across the Ohio River, a proper ferry that made regular trips between Detroit and Windsor, Ontario. They traveled openly, without hiding, without fear, because once they reached the Canadian side, no one could ever make them go back. Celia stepped onto Canadian soil at approximately 10:30 in the morning. The sun was shining. The air smelled of summer. And for the first time in her life, she was standing in a place where slavery did not exist. She was free. Truly, completely, permanently free. The group that had started as 39 people had been reduced to 24 by the time they reached Canada. They had lost one person to illness in Mississippi. Old Josephine's group of 12 had never arrived at the Memphis rendezvous point and was never heard from again. The others had made it, against all odds, against every obstacle that slavery and geography could throw at them. And Celia had led them. The woman who had been purchased for $650 in Charleston 17 years earlier, who had been recorded in a ledger as nothing more than a function, who had been invisible for so long that she had almost forgotten she existed, had led 23 people to freedom. Now she would build a new life. Celia settled in St. Catharines, Ontario, a town that had become a haven for escaped American slaves. The community there was thriving, filled with former slaves who had made similar journeys from the American South. They had built churches, schools, businesses, and homes. They had created a society where black people could live with dignity, could own property, could raise their families without fear. It was also the home of Harriet Tubman, the most famous conductor on the Underground Railroad. Celia met Tubman shortly after arriving in St. Catharines. The encounter was brief, a conversation between two women who had both risked everything for freedom, who both understood what it meant to walk out of bondage. Tubman listened to Celia's story, nodded in recognition at certain parts, and offered one piece of advice. "Keep cooking," Tubman said. "Your food kept you alive. Now let it give you a life." Celia took that advice to heart. Within 6 months of arriving in Canada, she had opened a boarding house in St. Catharines. She called it the Freedom Table. It was a modest establishment, just a few rooms for travelers and a dining room where anyone could come for a hot meal. But the food she served there became legendary. Former slaves who crossed the border would often make their way to the Freedom Table as their first stop in Canada. They would sit at Celia's table, eat her cooking, and hear her story. They would understand that freedom was possible, that survival was possible, that a new life was waiting for them if they had the courage to reach for it. Samuel grew up in St. Catherine's, attending school with other children whose parents had escaped slavery. He learned to read properly, to write fluently, to do mathematics that would have been unthinkable for an enslaved child in Louisiana. He eventually attended college in Toronto, one of the first generation of Black Canadians to receive a higher education. He became a teacher, then a principal, then an advocate for education rights. He died in 1921 at the age of 68, a respected member of his community, surrounded by grandchildren who would never know what slavery felt like. Celia lived long enough to see the end of the Civil War, the abolition of slavery, and the beginning of Reconstruction. She lived long enough to see the 13th Amendment ratified, making freedom permanent for 4 million people who had been property just months before. She lived long enough to know that the world she had escaped was gone forever. She died in 1892 at the age of 62. Her obituary in the St. Catherine's newspaper described her as a beloved member of our community, known for her extraordinary cooking and her even more extraordinary courage. It mentioned her boarding house, her charitable work, her role in helping newly arrived refugees from the American South. It did not mention the Beaumont family, the empty safe, or the plate she had left on the dining room table. But those who knew her story remembered. The Beaumont family, meanwhile, met a very different fate. The loss of their enslaved labor force, combined with the loss of their savings, devastated Magnolia Grove plantation. Henri Beaumont attempted to recover by hiring workers, but the economics of cotton farming without slave labor proved impossible. Within a year, he was deeply in debt. Within 2 years, he had lost the plantation to creditors. Henri Jr., whose gambling debts had started the cascade of events that led to Celia's escape, fled to Texas to avoid his creditors and was never heard from again. Marguerite Claire returned to her husband's family in Natchez, where she lived out her days in reduced circumstances, always complaining about the quality of the food. Philippe abandoned his law studies and joined the Confederate Army, dying at the Battle of Shiloh in April 1862. Henri Beaumont, Sr., suffered a massive heart attack in October 1863. He was eating dinner when it happened, sitting alone in a rented room in Baton Rouge, a far cry from the grand dining room of Magnolia Grove. He was 61 years old. He weighed, according to the death certificate, approximately 310 pounds. The cause of death was recorded as heart failure. Marguerite Beaumont survived her husband by 3 years, dying in 1866 in a charity hospital in New Orleans. She had spent her final years dependent on the kindness of strangers, a woman who had once commanded dozens of servants, reduced to accepting whatever help she could find. Her final words, according to the nurse who attended her, were about food. She was hungry, she said. She was so terribly hungry. The great plantation house of Magnolia Grove burned to the ground during the Union occupation of Louisiana in 1863. Whether the fire was set deliberately by Union soldiers, by former slaves returning to destroy a symbol of their oppression, or by accident was never determined. By the time the flames died down, nothing remained but the brick chimneys, standing like monuments in the ashes. The land itself eventually became a small farming community after the war. The descendants of enslaved people from surrounding plantations settled there, working the soil that their ancestors had worked in bondage. They built homes, raised families, and created a community that would endure for generations. None of them remembered the Beaumont family except as a cautionary tale about the price of cruelty. But they remembered Celia. Her story was passed down through generations, told and retold around kitchen tables and church gatherings. It became legend, then myth, then something even larger, a symbol of resistance, of hope, of the power of ordinary people to change their circumstances through courage and intelligence. The empty plate she left on the Beaumont dining room table became the most powerful image of her legacy. It represented everything that slavery had taken, and everything that the enslaved had taken back. It was a statement of defiance, of pride, of humanity that could not be bought or sold or beaten into submission. "You ate our pain for 17 years, she had written. Now feel hunger." Those words echoed through history, Through the Civil War and Reconstruction and Jim Crow and the Civil Rights Movement and every struggle for justice that followed. They were quoted by abolitionists, by activists, by anyone who understood that true freedom meant more than just escaping chains. It meant claiming your humanity. It meant refusing to be invisible. It meant standing up, finally, and saying, "I am here. I matter. And I will not be silent anymore." Celia never intended to become a symbol. She just wanted to save her son. She just wanted to be free. She was a cook who couldn't read until she taught herself. A mother who could not protect her child through any legal means. A woman who had been told her entire life that she was nothing. She proved them wrong. The night she walked out of Magnolia Grove Plantation, she carried nothing but her son, a bag of stolen money, and 17 years of watching and waiting and planning. She left behind a world that had tried to destroy her, and walked toward a future that no one had promised her. She made that future herself, one step at a time, through swamps and forests and rivers and darkness, until she finally stood in the light. This was her story. This was her victory. And this was her gift to everyone who came after, the knowledge that no matter how hopeless things seem, no matter how powerful the forces arrayed against you, it is always possible to fight back. It is always possible to survive. It is always possible to win. You just have to be willing to take the first step. And then the next. And then the next. Until finally, against all odds, you find your way home.